Hey everybody, this is Jack Allwile with another money episode. Today we have Aaron Ameen on with us. He is at Aaron Ameen, spelled Aaronameen on Twitter. And you can find him at thehybridrealestateprofessional.com. Aaron, it's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
So before we get into what exactly is a hybrid real estate professional and some of your background, we like taking a step back, asking what was your relationship with money growing up?
Absolutely. I love this question. I was excited to hear this be part of the interview. So I was very lucky to have the upbringing I did. I grew up primarily with my mom and my stepdad in Washington State in the 90s. They both worked at Microsoft. And for those who are familiar with Microsoft, the 90s was a particularly prosperous era. They worked on a product called Encarta, which was a CD-based encyclopedia product for those who are old enough to remember. And my dad worked at Hewlett-Packard, which was at the time a Compaq. So I have a strong, family background in the tech industry in the 90s. So everyone did pretty well financially. But the part that I like to remember and the part that I spent a lot of time absorbing as a kid was my parents' backgrounds. So my dad grew up in Bangladesh in the 60s and 70s during a civil war. And he grew up with very little money and in a very tumultuous time. Bangladesh wasn't even a country until 1973. And so, just unbelievably different and contrasting background to what I grew up with. He came to the United States with $2,000 in his pocket in 1982. He worked his way through college by working 3 jobs, and he finished college in 2.5 years. So he would have to pay less in, room and board and tuition and all that. So he really paved the path for our family. And even though he made a lot of money in his life, he sent a large chunk of that back to his family and supported his mother and other family members back in Bangladesh. So that always stuck with me. My mom and my stepdad worked very hard. They were in Microsoft, which paid well, and that bet paid off for sure. The stock they got early on did very well for them, but it also was a very hard work. I remember spending, the evenings my mom would come pick me up from daycare at 5 o'clock, and we'd go to the Microsoft campus and stay there until 8 o'clock until my bedtime. And so I saw that even though they were generating a lot of money, there was a cost to it, in lifestyle and some of the sacrifices they had to make. With that said, I had a great relationship with my family and a very comfortable life. My mom and stepdad also were real estate investors. So that may indicate some of how I got into real estate investing. I watched them start. They started building a portfolio in the early 2000s when we lived in California, and they invested kind of through the waves of the last 20 years. So they turned 3 rental houses in San Diego into 10 rental houses in Knoxville, Tennessee, which is where I went to school. That was right in like 2007, 2008. And then, of course, as did many people, they got caught holding the bag with those rentals, and the values dropped significantly. That's a whole other story, but there was a series of things that happened with those rentals that, were very challenging for them. But they held and held and held until the values came back to, at a minimum of break even, and they were able to get out from under that portfolio without totally kind of ruining their financial lives. They were also entrepreneurs. They took a break from the tech industry and started a small business. So I say all this because I've been exposed to all these different ways that my parents have gone about making, preserving, spending, and contributing their money. So my specific background was pretty uneventful because I was just a kid growing up in a kind of upper middle class household, but I really did take their backgrounds to heart and try and internalize that as I figured out what money meant to me.
Awesome. So those three rentals originally in Cali that they parlayed into the 10 in Knoxville, were you involved much with seeing them? Did you get to see any of the repairs being done or how they managed it? How involved did your parents get you to show you kind of, a glimpse behind the curtain?
So I was between the ages of 10 and
Okay,
17 when I lived in San Diego. So I was aware, but definitely not involved.
gotcha.
I remember when they bought them. I had seen, I believe, all of them. But I was only like in the periphery aware of what
Mhm.
they were actually doing. And it wasn't until I actually started, getting interested in my own rentals 15 years later that I actually started asking them a lot more questions about their experience in rentals.
Gotcha. So, okay, so that leads to the next question. So, what was kind of the light bulb or switch that you said, okay, I saw my parents do this. 15 years later, real estate is the vehicle I'd like to use to grow my wealth and preserve and all that good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish I could say there was a singular light bulb, but it was kind of a series of events. I worked the first 10 years of my professional career, I worked in the concerts industry. I was a booker. At first, I was a booking assistant, and then I grew into a role as an actual booker. I worked for a company called Live Nation. Most people are probably familiar with them if they've ever been
Yeah.
to a concert. They own Ticketmaster, House of Blues, and most recently, they've been gobbling up and acquiring every major promoter in the country. But I worked for them coming out of college. And I also moved down to Las Vegas for 5 years from 2015 to 2020. And so we were right in the hub of the entertainment industry. There's more tickets being sold in that city than most cities within a week than most cities have in a month. Right? There's something like 100,000 seats to fill every night, and so that was a very exciting and very action packed career path, but it was also very, very exhausting. And I would say it also the entertainment industry is historically low paying. They know that there's 200 people lined up for every job that exists. And so it felt very much like a treadmill. I was working really, really hard and pouring a ton of my heart and soul into the job. I was getting great experience, but it wasn't paying well, and it wasn't paying as well as I could have been paid for the same type of skills in a different industry. So that was one thing I noticed was like, putting a ton of work in and not necessarily getting the return out that I would have maybe liked to see. And it also took a toll on my mental health. Without going into the full story, like I really hit a high anxiety period. I was drinking way too much, stressing way too much, and it became a kind of cyclical downward spiral. And I hit a relative bottom in 2019, and I had to make some pretty significant changes. And a lot of that energy that I had been directing in all the wrong ways, I turned around and after I made an abrupt change, I quit drinking. I got some help that I had needed at the time, and I wanted somewhere to place my energy, and I decided that was going to be in service of my wife and my family. We didn't have any kids at the time, but I knew that that was the direction we were heading, and so I wanted to plant some seeds that could grow, long into the future. So I started looking around at I've always been interested in investing in money, but I really started studying. I was looking at stocks. I was just learning about like how to construct a balanced portfolio. Like what you make money, but what do you do with money? That was the question I was trying to answer for myself. And then that's when I started to recall back to my parents' experience and how they had, built this giant portfolio of rentals. And I started asking questions. And it turned out that, the neighborhood, my wife and I had bought a primary house near downtown Las Vegas in 2017. And at the time, this was kind of before that 2020, 2021 run up. You could still get a really nice 4-bed, 2-bath house, 1,500 to 1,700 square feet for about $250,000. coming from Washington State, that was unheard of. So, to us, that sounded like a great deal. So we decided to buy a rental in Vegas down the street from where we lived. We didn't know anything about how to analyze deals. We didn't know anything about how to run, how to self-manage or do any of the stuff that we now know. So I would say we really did kind of take that blind leap of faith, just to get our foot in the door and understand what it would be like. I can go through the whole evolution of where we went from there, but essentially, the overused phrase, the rest is history.
So can you maybe recall some resources you used early on, maybe some books or specific podcasts that really you felt drove your understanding of the sector in those early times?
Yeah, so it's interesting. That first rental property was done almost entirely based on conversations I had with my parents.
Okay.
I realized that, in hindsight, I leaned way too heavily on them, considering, they're very generous with their time and very willing to help, because I think they wanted to make sure that we were starting on the right foot and that we weren't taking undue risk. But I leaned on them for the kind of help and support to understand like the dynamics of incoming rent, outgoing expenses, like what are the types of things we need to budget for? Because they had a ton of experience at that point. By the time we bought, they had, 17, no, almost 20 years of experience across, dozens of properties. And so I felt like, one of the other issue when you're starting out is you don't know who to trust, right? That's a big issue when you're consuming content, especially on the internet or books, right? Like, yes, there's published authors and reputable sources, but at the time I went to the people that I trusted the most, which was my parents. Now, with that said, we bought 2 more houses later that year. The agent who sold us those houses, the agent who sold us the first rental brought us 2 more deals that were a package deal. And long story short, they were on 5-year leases, paying above market rent with built-in escalators. They were the kind of deal that's just like too good to be true. Felt too good to be true. And once he brought those to us and we decided, hey, these are so good that we need to figure out how to rearrange whatever we need in our lives to get these. That's when we kind of realized, like, okay, this isn't just some side project where we own one rental and we're going to go about working our day jobs and maybe, deal with a tenant every once in a while. Like, we're actually becoming real estate investors now. Mm-hmm. This is going to be a part of our identity. And at that point, that's when I started to really lean in and look towards, forums and books and start consuming all of the massive content available. And as with many people, I started, Bigger Pockets was one of the first, forums I came across. There was another one called Roofstock Academy. For those who aren't familiar, Roofstock is a website where their primary business is they have a portal where you can buy and sell specifically single family rental properties. So they're very singularly focused. They don't do, large multifamily or anything like that. And you can go and people list their properties that already have tenants in them or are already set up to be rentals. And so anyway, that's their primary marketplace, but they also had a spinoff called the Roofstock Academy. And that was the first real educational resource and community that I dove straight into. Awesome. And they had a spinoff Slack community where you could go in and ask questions, and they did some coaching and things like that. And so once we had that layout of like, hey, we're going to have several rentals, I figured let's start to plug in and meet some peers and be able to ask those questions.
Awesome. So let's break down your portfolio. So on your Twitter page, it shows you have 8 rentals in 3 different states. So the first, I guess, 3, that package deal on the 5-year lease, was that also in Vegas?
Yes, they were.
Okay. So how many do you have in Vegas total?
So we had 4. We actually just sold one, but okay. So we started with a primary down in Vegas that we bought in 2017. Then we bought those 3 rentals I mentioned between 2019 and 2020. And when COVID hit, as is no surprise to anyone, the concerts industry pretty much disintegrated overnight, which forced me to seek employment elsewhere. Unemployment reached 26% in Las Vegas. And so we immediately looked elsewhere for employment. That's what brought us back up to Washington State, where I had finished college and most of my professional network was. We moved up there. I switched to a job in the consulting industry. Those details aside, we lived there the last 3 years. And in those 3 years, we bought a duplex with my parents. We co-purchased, co-managed that in Central Washington. And then we actually bought another primary property in Central Washington too. And that became a rental as of last week.
Cool.
We just moved to Houston, Texas. And so instead of selling our primary house up there, we actually held onto it and turned it into a rental. The other 3 properties we own are in Iowa, in an area called the Quad Cities. This is the only area that we had 0 prior connection to. We didn't live there. We don't have family there. This was back at the end of 2021 and early 2022. We knew at that point that we wanted real estate to be part of our long-term game plan for our family. We enjoyed it. We had spent a lot of time learning, and we wanted to find a new market that we could actually afford to invest in. And Washington State, we were having trouble finding anything that made sense. Same thing, pretty much anywhere on the West Coast. And even Vegas at that point had kind of become out of reach. So we researched several markets in the Midwest and the South, and we landed on that area called the Quad Cities in Iowa. It's right where Iowa and Illinois meet the border, split by the Mississippi River. It's a pretty stable, run-of-the-mill Midwest town. They got a lot of blue-collar jobs, but they also have like data centers and some like regional distribution for supply chain and logistics companies. Just a pretty like standard, few 100,000 person metro area. And you could buy a house there for a pretty nice house, 3-bed, 2-bath, in good shape for about 100 to 125,000, and you could rent it for probably 11 to 1,400 bucks. So that market was almost entirely cash flow based. We knew it wasn't going to be the next San Francisco, the next Austin, anything like that. But what we did know is that we could afford to invest there and that the cash flow made sense. And as long as we bought, using good fundamentals and put the right team in place, that could be a nice supplement to some of the other real estate that we owned. So those are the 8. We currently have 3 in Vegas, 2 in Washington, and 3 in Iowa.
When you were deciding to go into Iowa, what other cities were you analyzing, and what was kind of the tipping point to pick the Quad Cities area?
It's a great question, and I wish I had a more precise answer. We did look at like St. Louis was on the list, Huntsville, Alabama was on the list, Memphis was on the list. I'm trying to remember. I know there was one other further north, but essentially we don't have family that live in Quad Cities. One small ancillary benefit of being up there was that my wife is from Chicago area.
Wow, okay.
And so a lot of the fundamentals were somewhat similar between these areas. But we had the benefit of when we go to see my wife's family, we could string it into a trip out there. It was only about a 2.5, 3-hour drive. So that was one. I know that's not a great reason to lock into a 30-year loan on a place, but all things being somewhat similar, that was a nice benefit. The other piece was we looked at a lot of extreme weather conditions and insurance factors. And so like some of the markets in the South were very prone to storms or things that could just put additional wear and tear on the house. Mm-hmm. Iowa is still prone to a lot of, weather related events, but not quite as much as some of the other places we were looking. So that was a factor. And beyond that, I'll be honest, we had a really open mind. Like our goal was to prove to ourselves that we could make the long distance remote investing concept work. That was the goal of the exercise.
Cool.
And I think we could have made it work in several other markets. I still think there's a chance we might, find other markets and expand into them. But this was really kind of a proof of concept for us that we could, kind of take ourselves to the next level and get out from just, areas that we knew just because we live there, and pick somewhere like based on fundamentals and grow accordingly.
Awesome. I mean, this is a common thing, but people always think they have to invest in their area, and to go outside their state seems a world away. How did you get comfortable with that? And what did you do for management? I'm sure a lot of people are like, how do you vet management? Because I'm assuming you have a property manager for the ones in the Quad Cities.
We do. And it's so funny because the first house we bought there was a complete disaster, mainly because of the property manager that we initially went with.
Okay.
So we found a house that was in great shape. It had been fully remodeled. It had been remodeled pretty well. It wasn't a total lipstick on a pig situation. Like, they actually did a good job. We found an agent off Zillow, which I actually was, that is not what I would recommend doing in general, especially for investors. So that's one thing that I would do differently. But we found an agent off Zillow. She did well by us. We worked with her for all 3 transactions. She was well connected and actually helped us plug into a few different people who became integral parts of our team. But she wasn't like a investor's agent, if you will. Like, she wasn't like her primary client was the typical home buyer. But anyway, so we met our agent on Zillow, and the property manager was the one we knew, like, hey, we need to spend the most time on due diligence. We need to ask all the right questions. And I used some of the training on Roofstock Academy. They actually had a list of questions and some of the typical things you want to know about a property manager. And I took some of their questions, and I actually created a new list of questions that I wanted to ask and know. I actually published this. I have a template pack. If people go to my Twitter profile or newsletter, you can download that for free. But I created this kind of due diligence checklist for all the different team members you want on your real estate team. I spent about 2 hours interviewing the first property manager that we worked with. It was a company called Enhanced Homes. And the gentleman I was talking to was their director of operations and investor relations. And he talked a good game. He answered all my questions to my satisfaction. He had told me the kind of exact business model they run and their system and how many people they had on staff. And as people who had primarily self-managed up until that point, this all sounded wonderful because we had never worked with a property manager. We had never had a fully functional business that where they had, maintenance people on staff. And so these things were kind of lighting us up that, like, oh my God, we can just have one point of contact that's going to take care of all this stuff and we don't have to do it ourselves. Yeah. So long story short, the guy talked big game. He answered all our questions well. But when we finally actually closed on the property and he took over, he had us list the property about $300 a month higher than what it should have been listed at. It was the middle of January in Iowa. We closed on the house. It was snowing and super cold up there as it gets. And there were a number of issues. It turned out he had never even been to the property since the day of closing. It sat on the market for almost 8 weeks with no leads. And the gas had been shut off. Oh. And there was no heat in the house. And they had a lockbox on the door, and they were just their idea was they would just let people walk in and show themselves around if they want. They didn't even have a leasing agent or anything like that. So when we finally, we should have noticed this a lot sooner, but when we finally found this out, this was our first remote investment, right? Like we were pretty devastated. We're like, okay, this is like about as bad as this could go. We don't know what kind of damage there might be. We don't have any leads. We've now started making mortgage payments, and like, what are we going to do? So we called our agent, and she put us in touch with another property manager who we interviewed, and we kind of explained the situation. Like, hey, like we got screwed here. and we're in a pickle. Long story short, she came in, and within a week, so we fired the original property manager. He had no he wasn't surprised at all. He was like, "Yeah, we've done a terrible job," and he gave her the keys, the new manager the keys. Within 7 days, she had everything fixed. She had a tenant signed and leased in place at the same rent that we had underwritten the property at, and had everything stabilized and under control. So it was obviously just a misfire on who we picked for the first manager.
Wow. So
We went.
sorry. So first of all, I guess the pipes didn't freeze and burst. So
There
that's
was
good.
one. There was one pipe
Okay.
that froze, but thankfully it did not totally,
Okay.
infect the rest of the house.
And I think a lot of people struggle with when to make a change from a poorly run property management company. So how long from when you hired them to when you fired them? Because it sounds like you did. I mean, with this circumstance, you acted pretty quickly, actually. So how long was that period, actually?
Yeah, so it was 8 weeks from the day we closed until the day we let them go.
Okay.
And if I had to do it again, I would probably have done that sooner. We were giving them a lot of grace that, like, hey, they advertised the rent too high. We're all for trying to, aim a little high and then adjust down if you need to. But they didn't want to adjust down, even though we weren't getting leads, right? So that was one warning sign. And then the second is, like, obviously once we found out that they weren't even going over to the property, they weren't even aware that there wasn't heat, like that's a terminable offense right there.
Yeah.
We're lucky because we didn't have a tenant in place, a lease in place. Like, it's much harder to change property managers in the middle of a lease than it is before you even get it leased. Because at this point, when we let them go, all we had to do was grab the keys out of the lockbox, and they just had to take their lockbox. Because they didn't have anything in flight and they didn't actually do anything, there wasn't a lot to untangle.
Now,
So we were lucky.
Yep. I think another question people might have now, when you were interviewing these property managers, had you gone physically to their offices, like when you were visiting your wife's family, or was this all over the phone or a Zoom? How did that go out?
We did not go to this market until after
Okay.
we owned
Gotcha.
the first property. We
Okay.
did not make a visit there. So that was part of our testing this strategy out, was, can we do this all completely sight unseen? Can we do this without having to set foot on the ground? And can we trust our process enough? Can we do the due diligence? And in part, the answer is no. Like, we didn't do the due diligence correctly. There's warning signs that we didn't see the first time around. We should have spent a little more time up front making sure we had the right team members in place. It's difficult because anyone can say the right things on the other end of a phone call. Yeah. Like, he knew what to answer. He knew the things that he should have been saying. He knew the way that a company should be run, but that's not how they were running it. And so one thing I didn't do, which total shame on me, is I should have called multiple investors that worked with them. That's something now where when we work with a property manager, like, that's one of the first things we do is make sure that, they can provide us investors that work with them. But of course, then they're cherry picking their best investors. So I always try and scout around and do some due diligence and figure out, like, what's the actual experience like, read all the reviews. Most people don't take the time to write a review unless they had a bad experience. So you do have to take those with a grain of salt. Oftentimes, any service-based company, like, the reviews you're going to read are the people who something went wrong. The people that everything went right, they don't usually take the time to write a review. That's just the nature of it. But yeah, so we're very lucky that we were able to turn it around that quickly. Once we had our new team in place, that was the first time we went to see my wife's family, and then we actually made a trip out there, met our property manager, met our agent, and started, like, shaking hands and really solidifying some of those relationships. We had a lender, we had a lawyer. That's when we really started to feel like, hey, we have a team, and we know who they are. We've seen them, they've seen us, they've met our daughter. They know that, like, we're people. And those human connections do make a big difference.
Yeah. I wouldn't be too hard on yourself. 8 weeks sounds pretty short to me. one of my property managers, I think I probably waited like a year or two long in one case. So don't be too hard on yourself there. Now, one thing I wanted to ask, but before we actually get into what a hybrid real estate professional is, what one thought I had when you said you sold the property a while back. Now, I think a lot of people are sitting on a lot of equity right now in some of their houses. And I guess I'd be curious on the thought process of, weighing just selling versus refinancing and pulling cash out, or how that decision process shaped out.
I'm really glad you asked. So this was a tough one because this was our first house that we ever bought. It was our primary house. Mm-hmm. We got married in the backyard of this house. We had some sentimental attachment to it. It was our first ever home together. My wife and I built a life there. We turned it into a rental, and we had been holding it as a rental for pretty much the last 3 years since we moved from Vegas. But we had also, I mentioned those two properties earlier that are on the 5-year leases. The way we financed those was by doing a cash out refi on that same house. Okay. And we pulled that money out and we put it into those other two. So we had a primary house. We did a cash out refi that turned into 2 other rentals. We turned this into a rental. We had gotten some great use out of this house. Mm-hmm. Now, even with the cash out refi, we were sitting on a 3.375 rate. Mm. So it was really hard to grapple with the idea of selling this property, given, where rates are today. It was a cash flowing rental. Rent we were collecting was $2,000, and our mortgage, principal, interest, tax, and insurance was around $1,300. So after we budgeted for expenses, we were cash flowing, $200 or so on per month. That is something hard to let go of. Mm-hmm. Like that, in a perfect world, we would have kept it. Alas, I told you before we started recording, my wife and I are expecting twins at the end of this year. We had, quite a few personal life circumstances change such that the cash in our pocket was a bit more important to us than, holding onto this rental forever, especially when we had already gotten so many great uses out of it. So, we bought that house in 2017. It had appreciated quite a bit since then. It had dipped quite a bit down since where the value was this time last year. Had we sold it a year ago, we probably would have gotten maybe 80 to 100,000 more. So that's a little hard to stomach too. But the last piece of the puzzle that really was the tipping point is because we lived there 2 out of the last 5 years, the IRS, allows us to qualify for capital gains exclusion, meaning, we had about $110,000 in gain, and all of that was completely not subject to capital gains tax. So that would have been whatever it was, $27,000 extra that we could keep in our pocket by selling it before September of this year. So that was probably the tipping point. And, we didn't turn around and put that into other rentals right now. That's really been money that gives us the comfort as my wife and I are entering this new phase of our life. Gotcha. That's the sleep well at night money.
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah. Thanks for breaking that down for us. I think it helps people kind of think about their options and what to think about. So yeah, awesome. Okay. So Aaron, what is a hybrid real estate professional?
Awesome. This one's always fun to explain. So the concept of a hybrid professional was pioneered by a woman named Dr. Sarah Beth Burke. She's a PhD, and she did the majority of her research on just what makes people's professional identities. So the concept is most people, especially in modern times, have multiple professional identities. So for me, right now, I work as a business manager at a management consulting firm. That's my day job. I'm also a real estate investor. I also write and publish a newsletter. I also offer coaching and consulting for new real estate investors. And I also have past identities, the ones I mentioned, right, where I was a concert promoter and a musician. All of these things, each bringing a diverse set of skills and experiences. And most people, the traditional way of thinking of things is that these are nice kind of compartmentalized pieces of our identity that we don't activate regularly. The concept of a hybrid professional is someone who embraces all of those identities and finds the skills that fit at the intersections, right? So for me, I work in the management consulting industry by day. There are a lot of parallels between management consulting and running a real estate portfolio. My days as a concert promoter, I used to book and manage, shows. Those are essentially spinning up P&Ls from scratch. And you had, your artist payments, you had your expenses, you had your ticket sales. There are a lot of, just incoming money, outgoing money. These concepts all play together, and stringing them together and activating them at the same time is what makes each person unique. So the concept is each person needs to understand, what are your unique identities and how can they fit into your goal, in my case, as a real estate investor. So I believe that our ability to produce income from a day job is one of our most valuable assets, especially when we're younger. That means we have more time to produce income. So for me, my W-2 is a pretty important part of what I'm working towards. I'm not like, I'm going to quit next month and go all in on real estate type person. I'm like, hey, these skills that I'm using at work are valuable in order to help me grow long-term as a real estate investor. So that's the concept in a nutshell. I'm sure there's probably a shorter way to explain that. I need to probably work on that. But yeah, so what I write about in my newsletter is how I have leveraged my personal professional identities in order to enable my real estate career, and how other people can identify their identities and do the same.
Awesome. You're a modern day Renaissance man, Aaron. Okay, so closing out, I always like to ask, what is the best and worst personal finance advice you've either received or heard?
I love it. I love it. So I was thinking about this, and I think if I had to pick one that was the best, it is to learn to wield credit responsibly. That's probably the best advice. So, for example, going back to the first question, what was my relationship with money growing up? My parents had a lot of money and I had a comfortable upbringing, yet they very, very strictly instilled in me that, open a credit card when you're 16, only use it for gas, pay it off every month. And from there, you're going to build credit. You're also going to learn that this piece of plastic in your hand is, even though there's, let's say, a $2,000 credit on it, you're going to learn the constraint and discipline to not max that out. And as subtle as it is, it's not necessarily something that I would applaud myself for. Like, yes, don't max out your credit card. It seems so logical and makes sense. That's a muscle that I think a lot of people don't build. And so I'm very grateful to my parents that they push so hard on building that discipline. And I actually think now I use credit cards for everything that I can. And I actually am one of those people that, like, I try and, get as many miles as possible on this one, or cash back at this place. I have a few different credit cards. And the only way I can do that and still pay them off every month is because I built that initial muscle. If not, it would be super easy for these to run out of control and I'd be carrying balances left and right at 20% interest rates. So that is probably the best early advice I got. And that does play into, obviously, mortgages and using debt responsibly. But I would say that was the genesis. And the worst, it's not necessarily a specific piece of advice, but I think one of the hardest things for our generation was this idea that the default activity after you graduate high school is to go into an expensive 4-year university. I think that, unfortunately, left a lot of people our age with crippling amounts of student debt, and many of them didn't even go on to work in an occupation related to what they studied. And so I disagree fundamentally with that being the default. I believe I went to a 4-year university. I went to a couple of different universities, so I didn't go straight through. But I believe in the power of university for networking, knowledge. Like, there's so many benefits. But I think people need to discover that and make that decision for themselves, not just kind of shepherd towards that. Financially, it can be as big of a detractor as it is a benefit if you don't, pick the right thing and and have a true alignment as to what you want to get out of it. So that's probably the worst that I could think of.
Great. Great responses, Aaron. Well, Aaron, why don't you tell the listeners where they can go learn more about you or get in touch with you?
Sounds good. I write online every day on Twitter at Aaron Ameen. And I also write a weekly newsletter, which is where I put the majority of my work into. Again, the newsletter is about how to build a life as a hybrid professional real estate investor. So the website is www.thehybridrealestateprofessional.com. And I write that every week.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Aaron. It's been a pleasure.
I appreciate you having me.